Hello, I want to talk about punctuation. I'm going to talk about commas. There are 5 reasons why you need to use a comma in English writing, and I've made a separate video for each of the 5 reasons, and I will link to them in the description box below. In this video, number 1, I'm going to talk about how you use a comma in a list. So this is what a comma looks like. It's sort of a full stop with a little tail on it, okay? So when you use a comma in a list, you use the comma to separate each of the items in the list. But you don't use a comma between the last 2 items, you just use the word and. Now, this is controversial, because in some systems you do use a comma to separate the last 2 items as well as the word and. And this is called the serial comma or the Oxford comma. If you're writing for a school or publication or institution, then you need to find out which system of commas your institution uses, if they require the serial comma or not. I'm going to talk about both kinds of comma in this video because they are both useful. So the general use of a comma is where you separate the items in a list, and a list has 3 or more items, but you don't use a comma to separate the last 2 items. You just use the word and instead. So here are some examples. In the first 2 sentences, there are 3 items in the list, and you only need to use 1 comma between the first and second item. The last 2 items, second and third, are separated by the word and you don't need a comma. The third example has 4 items in a list. So you use a comma after the first and second item, so you use 2 commas, but you don't use a comma between the last 2 items, you just use the word and without the comma. There are times though when the serial comma is very useful because it can add clarity to your sentence. And as a writer, what you need is clarity. You don't want a situation where the reader is actually unsure what you mean. So if we look at this example, in the first sentence, the comma has just been used in the general way without separating the last 2 items. And this leads to some confusion. I'm grateful to my teachers, Uncle John and Auntie Louise. Does this mean that Uncle John and Auntie Louise are my teachers and I'm grateful to them? Or does it mean that I'm grateful to my teachers and I'm also grateful to Uncle John and Auntie Louise? It's unclear. So in this instance, you should use a serial comma. I'm grateful to my teachers, Uncle John and Auntie Louise. When we use a comma, it introduces a pause. If we're reading out loud, we naturally pause at the comma. If we're reading silently, our mind naturally pauses at the comma, and it gives the sentence a rhythm that makes the meaning clear. So in the second sentence, it is very clear that we're talking about teachers who are separate from Uncle John and Auntie Louise. Another reason that you might want to use a serial comma is when the word and can be confusing. So for example, discussion and review could be considered as a single item on an agenda. So when you're writing, you need to make it clear, is discussion and review one thing or 2 things? And using the serial comma will make this very clear. So in the example sentence, the project manager brought everyone together for brainstorming, planning, discussion, and review. So the rhythm there and the comma makes it very clear that discussion and review are two separate items in the list. I've said that a list needs at least 3 items. Sometimes you use 2 adjectives together to describe the same thing, and we need to separate these with a comma. It's not really a list, but we do need to use the comma. So as you can see in the example, winter is usually a cold, wet season. We're describing the season and we're using 2 adjectives, cold and wet. We didn't use the word and, we just used a comma. And the same in the other sentence. The candidate must be experienced and qualified. We've used 2 adjectives to describe the same thing, but we haven't used the word and, we've just used a comma. 5 ways to use a comma, that's the first one, how to use commas in a list. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have found it useful. If you've liked the video, please give it a like. Subscribe if you want to subscribe to my channel, Mr. Wright. And if you have anything to say about commas and lists, Oxford comma or general comma, which do you prefer? Share your opinions, share the knowledge in the comments. Thank you very much for watching my video, and I look forward to talking to you again in the next video. Bye-bye.